Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So welcome to the webinar Taxonomies and Policies Guiding Toward a Just Transition. I'm pleased to welcome you on the 13th October, which is the day of disaster risk reduction. I will introduce to the speakers, and we have the executive director of the local network France today with us. And this news from the UN, so as I told you, is the today International for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is very important information for the world private sector, but also all players, and a little video for you.
This year's International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction is all about Target G of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. It is about enhancing the accessibility to early warning systems and risk information to everybody.
So if you want any more information about the UNDRR, the Sendai framework, so I encourage you to scan the QR code. I have been told that my audio was not on, but I've just presented this initiative from the UNDRR. Today is the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. So welcome, I'm Luca Uccello. I'm Sustainability and Sustainable Finance Manager at the local network France from the UN Global Compact. Before introducing you to Nils Pedersen, which is our Executive Director, a little suggestion about how to use the interpreter function on Zoom. So you may have on the bottom of the slide or on the top side of the slide the interpreter function. You click and choose your language of preference. So if you don't hear, please check that function out, and you will be able to hear in the language of preferences. Who we have today, I'm very happy to welcome Charlotte Garde-Landolfini from International Monetary Fund, and I will leave you the scene in a little bit to present yourself. Alessio Terzi from European Commission and author of the book Growth for Good. I hope that Alessio will have the time to tell us more about it. And unfortunately, Anna Kruip is sick. She could not join. She's a colleague from the United Nations Global Compact. So I will give you a couple of information about our initiatives in terms of just transition. And now I leave the floor to Nils Pedersen, our Executive Director. Thank you.
Thank you, Luca. Ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends and dear members of the UN Global Compact, it's my pleasure, it's my honor to welcome you today as the Executive Director of the Local Network France. So welcome you from Paris. I will just switch in 1 minute in French, and as it is an international conference and webinar, we will be speaking in English all the time. But in French, je voudrais remercier l'ensemble des participants et des membres français de votre présence aujourd'hui. Lucas vous l'a indiqué, vous pouvez switcher entre le français et l'anglais sur les différents canaux. Bien évidemment, vous pouvez poser vos questions en français dans le chat et je pense que soit Lucas fera la traduction, mais Charlotte comprendra sans problème les questions en français. Voilà, donc tout sera en anglais puisque c'est une conférence internationale et j'en profite pour remercier l'équipe de traducteurs, souvent bien invisibles, mais qui nous sont très précieux aujourd'hui dans ce webinaire. Donc, merci à vous pour le travail que vous effectuez bien souvent dans l'ombre. Thank you to all of you for being with us today. And I want to thank especially all my colleagues from the European local networks to be part of this webinar, because this is led by the French network, but this webinar is open to all the European network. So thank you to all of you. And in the meantime, it's important for us because we share the spirit of a one global compact within Europe, but also within all the world. And as you may know, we have local network, but this is one global compact all around the world through 70 local networks. So today, as Luca said, we will welcome only 2 speakers. I'm sorry, Anna Krupp is sick today, so it's happened. It's quite on the morning on New York for the moment, so we haven't been able to find someone else. So Luca will try to explain a little bit more to you what's happened from the UNGC. And thank you to Alessio, Terzi, and Charlotte Garde for being with us this afternoon. Just a few words. So companies from all around Europe are alarmed by what is happening in the world. Crisis and very strong issues required global coordination. In the meantime, while this crisis continues, companies still need to report on what they are doing, and they'll still need to invest on new projects and on innovation. So our guests today will give us their point of view on that issue. Answers are demanded, opportunities are to be discovered, and new investments need to be addressed. Today's speakers will tell us how the green transition, supported by new regulation, will help all European people and community forward the achievement on the SDG and the 2030 agenda. They will illustrate how this is possible and how these new roles are leading to the right directions. Just is a transition that will leave no one behind, north-south, south-south, north-north, and all countries should address the 2030 agenda. These policies and taxonomy, starting from the EU taxonomy, but also the taxonomy from other many countries, could drive forward businesses through uncertainties. But we will discover also that the green transition can become a real opportunity for new prosperity, and that the role of the UN Global Compact is supporting companies through a just transition. Finally, I would like to thank Luca for organizing this event, because this is a lot of work. So thank you, Luca, for leading this webinar. Please feel free to ask all the questions you want in the chat on the right from my window, or maybe on the left from your window, but please feel free. Thank you so much to be with us today. Thank you to joining this meeting, and please enjoy being with us. Thank you, and Luca, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Denise Pedersen. And so here we are going to start this webinar. I'd like to give you the floor, Alessio and Charlotte, to give us a little bio of who you are, what you're doing, and then I'll address to you a couple of questions so we can have a nice conversation. Alessio.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Luca. I hope you can all hear me all right. Thanks for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here and have a chat with you and Charlotte and participants today. Perhaps 2 words on me, on my side, and who I am and where I'm coming from, or why I'm sitting in this seminar. I am an economist. Nobody's perfect. I work at the European Commission, as Luca was mentioning, and I work in the economics department. And what I do, or what I've tried to do over the past 3.5 years that I've been working there, is to make sense of the overall economic strategy that the European Commission is following to become climate neutral by mid-century, so the European Green Deal. And in light of that, this is also where some of my other efforts, so the book that Luca was mentioning, is addressed to, which is a book, A Growth for Good, published earlier this year by Harvard University Press, that tries to reflect on what is going to happen to the economy as we decarbonize, and how do we reconcile the economy with nature. Just as a side note, I'm also a lecturer on some of these topics, both at Sciences Po in Lille and at HEC in Paris.
Thank you, Alessio. So, Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luca. Can you hear me well? Okay, great. Very nice to be here with you today. For once, I'm in France, so I can actually be on the same time zone, so that feels good. So my name is Charlotte. I work at the International Monetary Fund in the Department of Monetary Capital Markets. I'm in charge of topics related to the primarily private financing of the energy transition and the role of the fund in this respect in terms of de-risking, blended finance, lending, surveillance, policymaking, but I'm guessing that we'll touch upon these issues later today. I've been working at the fund for about a year now, and before that, I worked at the French Treasury Department, where I was in charge of the negotiation of the primary EU regulations on sustainable finance on behalf of France, and did quite a few other things related to extra financial reporting, but also to sectoral policies by financial institutions and climate risk management. I am also a lecturer in several universities, now primarily in the US, and a member of several committees on my personal or professional capacity, in charge of decarbonization or research on climate-related risks. I'll stop here to leave you the floor, Luca.
Thank you. So thank you to both guest speakers. So we actually prepared this previously, but it's nice to have this conversation and tackle these issues. So today we have seen that private sector, public sector, but even consumers, ground public, are asking more and are pushing either companies or international institutions, national institutions. So my question to you, and I address that first to Charlotte, is how do we answer to them? Are these taxonomies, are these policies going to be the answer, the right answer? Are we on the right rail?
No, thank you for that question, actually. Didn't prepare for that, so let me just reply up front, and it's probably going to surprise some of you, but I don't think so. And the reason why I don't think so, I think it's always been presented, at least extra financial reporting, the EU taxonomy. I can recall here in between parentheses that there are about 40 national or regional taxonomies in the world, not just the EU one. It's always been presented, at least by, let's say, in a political manner, the main piece of the puzzle. When it's one of the pieces of the puzzle, it's definitely very important for companies to be able to measure what they do and to be able to measure their risks. And for that, they need to gather information internally. They need to publish it for many reasons that we'll probably touch upon today as well. But it's not the end of the day, because at the end of the day, they have to decarbonize effectively. And for that, it's not just great extra financial reports and accounting that are going to change all of that, though accounting might actually be the actual next step. It's all about pricing. It's all about competition. It's all about access to technologies. It's all about the impact on wages, on jobs, on your workforce. So that's definitely important, but that's not, in my view, the most, or let's say the only important policy that can be pursued. And I'll finish just by saying, because I don't know how much you were letting me to answer that first question, how long, but I'll maybe just say that it's, you know, working at the IMF, you tackle these topics within a much broader macroeconomic and debt-oriented world, where there are many issues for many countries outside Europe. And these issues actually should matter to European countries, given, you know, the fact we live in a globalized world, and a lot of, you know, the phone I'm talking with has not been produced in Europe, apparently. So it's very important for companies to also take that into consideration. And the reason why I'm saying that is that at the end of the day, you need planning, you need decarbonization pathways, you need strong government action, you need cooperation with companies, all of that. I'm just tackling this in a very broad way because what I meant to say is just that reporting, taxonomies, it's one piece of the puzzle and that's it. And that doesn't mean that, you know, we should put all of our efforts there. Alessio, as an economist as well, would probably not contradict me by saying there is no study that shows that transparency is actually, you know, leading to decarbonization. It's just one piece of the puzzle. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Very interesting to know that, Alessio. So, from your point of view, at the European Commission.
So, just for the audience, me and Charlotte met 5 minutes ago for the first time. So there is a limited coordination between us, but I'm glad that she and she is again, just to be clear, she is the taxonomy expert between the two of us, because as I said, I'm more of an expert of how it all comes together, and because I'm an expert of how this all comes together, I can only second what Charlotte said in terms of the role of the taxonomy, and I think it has a role, but how it is not the silver bullet, just because there is no silver bullet, and it is decarbonizing economies and reaching net zero is going to require a host of measures, and this is one of them. Perhaps for my 5-minute pitch or reaction to the overall topic, and so zooming out from just a focus on the taxonomy and looking at policies for the decarbonization, I guess I'm expected to a certain extent of saying a few words on the European Green Deal, which is fine. And my only word on the European Green Deal, which is the overall package or the overall policy package to reach climate neutrality, is something that needs to touch on all aspects of society. But it starts to a certain extent, or to my mind, with a target, with a commitment that is clear, and so you define what the objective is. In this case, having a medium target 2035, and then a climate neutrality target by 2050. And this is extremely important. It is even better if you enshrine it in law, as has happened in the European Union with the EU climate law. And it is important to my mind because it helps define what you're trying to achieve, and it sends an important signal to the private sector as well, and to the whole of society of a sense of direction. And I think this is important in terms of catalyzing efforts across spheres. So not only a public sector type of effort, but also private sector, and also to a certain extent consumers and citizens, to let them know what the sense of direction is. And the reason why I think this is important, and I'm going to pull out just one statistic or one piece of data, and I promise it's the only one for today and from my side, it links to the investment needs of the decarbonization. And it's very hard to make these estimates. We tried at the European Commission. There are some coming from the IMF. There are others made by other organizations. But when you try and do these things, the estimates of the investment needs, total investment needs, to reach these goals are in the ballpark of something like 300 billion euros for Europe alone every year between now and 2030. After that, it is even more. because you know, when in projections of how you decarbonize, you do the easy stuff first and then you leave the hard stuff for later. So this is just to give you a sense of how much money we're talking about, which means that it is very hard that governments alone can shoulder this. Actually, it is almost impossible that governments alone can shoulder this for a variety of reasons. And again, just to give you a sense of ballpark numbers or scales, the Next Generation EU, so this big package that was negotiated after COVID, and it's seen as really a crucial moment, and I think it is for European integration and so on. It is in the order of estimate of 700 billion. So roughly twice the size of the investment that we're going to need, and this is spread over 7+ years. Whereas we're going to need one Next Generation EU every other year between now and 2030, and then even more so. So we're not going to get that from the public sector alone, and that's why I think that the private sector plays a huge role, and much of the investment is going to come from the private sector. And the reason why this is instead totally feasible is that if you compare the number of investment that you need with respect to the size of the EU economy, which is, again, for a ballpark estimate, 14 trillion euros each year. And this means that we're talking of extra investment of roughly 2% percentage points of GDP. So again, we're not talking about something that is completely impossible. It is something that is possible, but it's going to require the private sector to be on board. And this brings me to my final point, which is that there's a lot of focus on what governments can do and policies, and rightly so. I sit in Brussels, I spend my day working on policies, so I am all about policy. I think an important point to get across is that the decarbonization is not going to be done only by policy measures, but rather it needs the private sector on board and it needs citizens on board. And only the sum of these forces combined will get us across the finish line. And so we're probably closer to a whole of nation approach when trying to reach decarbonization goals, rather than something that can be done top down from Brussels, from Paris, from Washington, DC, and so on and so forth. And I stop there.
That's very interesting. I'd like to highlight now what you both said. I mean, the need for information that may be catalyzed, and that's two words you said, Charlotte: information, price, Alessio, catalyzation, address the right direction, and that can be done through the right policies, through, of course, taxonomies, but then there is a need for keeping the investments long term, because people are probably forgetting that industrial revolution, as historians are saying, took like 70, 80 years. So here we are maybe in a second industrial revolution that is leading to new kind of technologies. And when we go to new kind of technologies, we're also talking about new kind of competencies, of skills, of expertise. So, and here comes the issue about the transition, which might not be always as a green transition, but also a just transition, because in any transition you may have winners and losers. So the Secretary General, and here the information I bring from the UN system is really about how do we also catalyze that. So maybe you already have touched that point, but that means that taxonomies and these kind of policies are going to impact companies and society, right? So in both your organizations, you have seen that, you have seen what may be the impact, and how do you think that your organization, I mean, in these cases, the FME, what are the actions or the programs you are leading in order to mitigate that, or to help the transition? And at the European level, what are those policies and programs that are going to help this transition? I go back to Charlotte on that.
Thank you, Luca, and thank you, Alessio, for your reply. Indeed, I mean, maybe let's go back to the roots of why the IMF looks at climate change. I mean, it may seem normal since it's the biggest challenge of all times, but still, climate change is bound to trigger major challenges for macroeconomic and financial policy management. It does so because it is materializing already through a variety of channels whose relative importance, of course, differs between countries and depending upon pre-existing vulnerabilities, debt-related vulnerabilities, the strain of the financial sector, geographical positioning, supply chain positioning. There are main, I mean, these transmission channels, I would say, are numerous. I mean, there is fiscal management, public debt sustainability, and that's why the IMF primarily, let's say, looks at climate change. There is financial stability. The role of the IMF is to preserve global financial stability. You all know, the types of climate risks that financial institutions and companies are exposed to. As physical risk intensifies, you have monetary policy that also can face challenges in terms of volatility of in output, in prices. It's got an impact on trade, on exchange rates, on exchange rate regimes, and all that. The thing is that, and to complement what Alessio was saying earlier, adaptation and resilience building are costly, fiscally speaking. Then you have climate change mitigation, also adaptation, and adaptation to a low carbon economy that requires significant changes to tax, to spending, to regulatory systems. And in the meantime, in that a little bit gloomy environment, you need to enhance the effectiveness of mitigation efforts, and this hinges on international policy coordination, or at least partly on international policy coordination. So the role of the IMF in this respect, and then I'll dig onto the taxonomy topic progressively, but first maybe to go back to the basics a little bit. The IMF does some direct country engagement. That means that you have these so-called Article 4 consultations, you have the financial sector assessment programs, and all of that. It's not just to publish nice reports, it's actually, it embeds a lot of topics such as energy subsidy reform, mitigation policies, resilience building, especially for climate vulnerable states, for small Pacific islands, for instance, for low-income countries in Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America. These programs, so Article 4 consultations and the financial sector assessment programs, they can anticipate policy reforms. They can also give an overview of the needs for external lending. So these are really important. There is also, and it's an increasingly important topic in that area, there is also an increasing area of demand for capacity development. Capacity development and technical assistance are one of the key missions, if I should say, of the IMF. It's in their mandate. So all of us, to some extent, do some kind of technical assistance and capacity development, especially in emerging markets, in developing economies, in low-income countries. And that's always being delivered in collaboration with institutions, for instance, like the World Bank, the IEA, but also, of course, with bilateral donors and with local governments. In areas as broad as fiscal issues, financial sector policies, regulation, supervision, also modeling support, for instance, to cover the domestic macroeconomic, external, and distributional implications of climate-related policies. Because when it comes to the just transition, you also have to evaluate internally in your own country the distributional consequences of those mitigation policies, but also the impact of global warming itself on labor and productivity on jobs. So all of that can be done through capacity development. So then the tip of the iceberg, I mean, you have, of course, all the flagship reports, the policy papers, the research that the IMF does produce, but that tip of the iceberg that actually, you've got all the multilateral surveillance. So the financial sector assessment programs are bank stress tests at macro level in one country, and each country in the world actually goes through that at some point. It's done by the IMF in collaboration with domestic authorities, so central bankers primarily, securities markets authorities sometimes. You've got capacity development, and of course you have lending. I mean, that's what the IMF is probably most famous for. For people who are not so well aware, let's say, with financial stability issues. On lending, and that's something I want to stress before coming to the topic of taxonomies, because that's all related. It's that you have a series of lending programs in the IMF. I won't go into detail into each one of them because there are many of them, but it's not just lending money. It's most of it is policy-based lending with what so-called conditionalities, but there is a new tool that has been approved by the board of the IMF. So in the executive board of the IMF, you've got 27 or 28 countries, if I'm not mistaken, including the United States and lots of European Union member states. So in April 2022, I was going to say last year, but that was this year, the IMF lending toolkit has been complemented by another tool called the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. So it's in addition primarily to the General Resources Account and the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. And that provides financing with a 20-year maturity and a 10.5-year grace period. And the reason why I'm primarily tackling the RST topic is that it's the first ever facility in the IMF that provides long-term affordable financing, and it aims to support countries to build resilience to structural challenges, primarily climate change and pandemics, and to help maintain longer-term economic and financial stability while catalyzing other public and private financing. And we'll maybe come back to that later today. So what's important here is really to have in mind that, and it's related to what Alessio was saying, financing, we're always giving those figures until 2030, but because without having the necessary volumes of financing that we do need by 2030, we'll then have to mobilize even greater financing afterwards, notwithstanding the actual cost of climate change and a delayed transition. So the RST, that Resilience Sustainability Trust, it's one of many, let's say, tools and actual financing tools that can help tackle that, especially in those economies that are eligible to the RST and that are primarily low-income countries. For instance, the first countries that have been approved, and maybe some of you have, sovereign debt nerds, as I call them, and myself included, have seen. There's Costa Rica, Barbados, also some Eastern African countries, potentially Bangladesh, so low-income countries and developing economies. So in all that, the IMF cannot mobilize itself private money. It's not its role, right? But there is a lot first of private sector engagement, especially when you work like myself in the monetary and capital markets department. You always discuss with global banks and investment funds and insurers, obviously, for many reasons, because we also do policymaking in terms of regulation and supervision. But you do also, one of the role of the IMF and multilateral development banks is also to de-risk investment, especially in those developing countries, low-income economies. It's to provide the capacity building for these economies to attract private investment, because as Alessio was saying, you cannot just rely on public money. Just to give you an example, another figure, the bond market, if I'm not mistaken, is around $125 trillion. So mobilizing very tiny part of that would actually probably make the difference. It's not the end of, it's not the silver bullet either, because when we talk about alignment of capital flows, on a low carbon pathway, it's not only about the additional money or the money you're actually putting for renewable energy, for instance. It's also, of course, aligning all types of investments on a low carbon pathway, including those that are not so well famous for that in sectors that, let's say, are not necessarily the ones you would think about when you think about the climate transition. But every dollar needs to be spent with a climate lens, at least in the back of your mind. And to do that, you have regulation, you have supervision, but you also need these countries to be able to attract that investment, notwithstanding all the difficulties they face. So the role of the IMF is also to do that. And so in that, let's say, global picture I've been trying to give you very quickly, hopefully very quickly, I don't see the time running. I'd say that we are really emphasizing the role of what we call at the IMF, and therefore, with our partner countries, the climate information architecture. It means that you have to see the role of disclosures, taxonomies. There are other alignment methodologies, but let's talk about taxonomies and data all together. You cannot just have a taxonomy that's a nice report and not being used, at least, with data and therefore also transparency purposes. And so that's where the role of taxonomies comes in our view, is that you need not only great data that you can gather without taxonomies, a lot of it, physical race data, for instance, but you need data on the advancement of the private sector on a low carbon pathway. And to that extent, the EU has been one of the leaders, obviously, not just with the taxonomy itself, because again, there are so many taxonomies out there as well, all over, Southeast Asia, primarily in South Africa now, currently being developed. It's my next meeting today, with Latin America and the Caribbean. So many taxonomies, but where the EU has been a front runner has been, it lies in the fact that the taxonomy is very well linked to disclosure requirements, with the now maybe famous in Europe, Article 8 of that taxonomy regulation that does provide for around, I would say, 60, 70 pages of transparency requirements for non-financial companies, for asset managers, for insurance companies, for commercial banks, including in their lending practices. So, and that's one of the ways, if those countries have taxonomies, can also attract some additional financing. So that's why we are also involved as the IMF on this topic. But I'll touch upon that probably later today, and I've been way too long, so sorry about that.
No,
I'm still a bit jet lagged from, just to say, I flew from the US a few hours ago, so I'm still jet lagged, so sorry about that.
So that means, so you said that all this is embedded, it's going to be embedded at bank level. That means that it's going to have an impact on companies, on freelancers, on people who have enterprises. So coming back again on the impacts of those policies and these technical reporting methodologies, which are taxonomies, Alessio, do you think that these impacts on an economic level are going, how do you see that to be absorbed by European companies? Is it an opportunity? How I remember once you told about pricing alignment or embedding at price level the costs of transition. I may have translated in a wrong way, but I really would like to hear from you on that.
Oh, thanks. Thanks a lot. I feel like Charlotte is going really into the details of policy, which is great, because it allows me to complement what she's saying so that we don't overlap each other's presentation. And perhaps what I would do is just to zoom out a second as to what we're trying to do here. And what I liked of what you said already in your introduction Luca, you mentioned two things. Effectively, the first, that are very close to my heart. The first is the idea that we should look at the decarbonization challenge as something close to an industrial revolution, in the sense that we are trying to reshape more or less everything, more or less, the whole of production, the whole of consumption, transport, housing, agriculture, and so on and so forth. And so the lens through which this should be read is an effort that is close to a new green industrial revolution. So that part I agree with. And the second thing that I liked of what you mentioned is to say, look, even industrial revolutions of the past took a lot of time, in the sense that even if we look at the first one, and the rollout of coal, of the steam engine, and so on, took, depending on the estimates, 70, 80 years, something like that. And we don't have 70 or 80 years because climate scientists tell us we've got to hurry to avoid the worst of the worst. And so what we're trying to do with policies is to accelerate this rollout of new technologies, innovation, new ways of doing things, different ways of doing things. Now, this is the way I primarily look at these things. And within this context, what I try to say is capitalism, for all its ills, for all its problems, and so on, if there is one thing that it has proven good at, is to be an effective machinery at fostering innovation, fast innovation. And so the challenge there is, how do we enroll this machinery, this system, onto our climate fight? And this thing will not happen alone because of a variety of problems. One of them is the classic, I think Charlotte already touched upon this idea that if so long as you have externalities, prices are not reflective of scarcity problems. And so you cannot expect a standard free market framework to solve issues of scarcity. Now, Lord Stern, which is one of the paramount figures in climate policy economics, has said that climate change is the greatest externality humankind has ever seen, because you have this problem of CO2 emissions that are not priced. And so they just go into the atmosphere, they create problems, but there is no price for that, or there hasn't been for a long time price for that. So it is within that context that you build up, you put in place things like the European Trading Scheme, which is a carbon pricing mechanism. There are others. I don't want to pretend the EU is alone in this. There are other jurisdictions. There are other ways of doing this. You can do it as a tax. You can do it, as in the EU, as a cap and trade system. Not going to go into the details of the differences. But what you're trying to do is to reinsert, to slap a price on things we don't like, so that then you can have a capitalistic type of framework doing its thing. It doesn't stop at that. Economists often tend to stop at that and say, the whole of climate change can be solved with carbon pricing. It is a big part of it. So I don't want to downplay this, but it doesn't stop at that. And it doesn't stop at that because there are other issues that might have arisen and that don't allow, let's say, free markets to reach the optimal equilibrium. And one of them links to the taxonomy, so to a point that is close to your heart. To my mind, one of the problems, or the problem that the taxonomy, including the EU taxonomy, is trying to address, is to say, in moments like this, so in moments of the big transition, there is, and big economic restructuring, moving to a different type of economy, there is a lot of uncertainty. And there is, to a certain extent, information asymmetry. What this means is that even investors, people with savings, me and you trying to do something with our bank account that want to support the green transition, we're not sure how to do that. And there is a lot of information out there. it is scattered, it is murky. It might be companies just adding the label green to whatever they're doing. And then I am in a situation of information uncertainty. What a taxonomy type of framework is trying to do is to add some clarity to this whole situation. In an ideal world, this is a temporary measure. So in the moment in which it is clear what we're trying to do, it is clear what technologies are going to support the green transition, and prices are right, so you have a carbon pricing mechanism that is working, that it is at the right level, ideally you would not need a taxonomy anymore. But it is important right now in order to get money flowing to the right direction, to support the right companies or the right technologies that are going to get us to the green transition.
So before going to the next question, which is related to cost and opportunity of this transition, there is a kind of underlining run and sprint among many probably industrial leaders who are trying to, keeping the situation as it is, or maybe trying to transform as much as they can. But the real question mark is, when are they going to get the critical mass to reduce the prices again, when they will achieve this kind of transition? So is this the point? Is the point of achieving a new critical mass in order to reduce costs and reduce prices, come back to the previous golden age of what we have seen in the last 20-30 years, or is it some kind of change factor is not going to be the same as it was before, and we are going to see a different kind of capitalism, different kind of cost of life? Do we have to get used to that? This is for both of you. Anyone who would like to answer?
I mean, I can start, but upfront, just, I mean, saying that prices are all relative anyway. So it's all a matter of, as Alessio was saying, coming back to that global equilibrium. But the thing is that in the absence of full pricing of these externalities, but also of the actual opportunities of investment in renewable energy, for instance, versus investment in a new coal-fired power plant, well, you don't have this equilibrium. So prices are of course skyrocketing, and across the board. I mean, I'm quoting here a famous speech now by one of the ECB executive board members, but you've got that greenflation because you see primarily metals prices going up, not just because of the COVID pandemic, not just because of the Ukraine war, for also other kinds of structural reasons. You have so-called climateflation, of course, given the higher and higher prices of inaction, or relative inaction, I should say. The cost of climate change are rising up, including in advanced economies. You've all been in Europe this summer, so you know what it means now. And fossilflation, as the cost of fossil fuels, and primarily natural gas and coal, obviously, going up as well, because of the Ukraine war, because of the pandemic, but also because of increased preferences for non-coal or gas-related investment that are also driving prices up. So I would say that, I mean, I would totally concur with what Alessio was saying, meaning that taxonomies are, and actually, yeah, the IMF were exactly even writing that, which is important when it's the IMF writing something, like taxonomies are complementary to carbon pricing. And what we mean by that is that even in the presence of a, let's say, perfect price, or price fully, reflecting climate change, you need some sort of a plan. You need some sort of a visibility over what needs to be done at economic activity level. Investors now are not just looking at the price of something, they're also looking at the competitive advantage of one technology to decarbonize railroads compared to and other technology. They're also looking at, you know, the technologies that need to be financed in South Africa and Malaysia versus what needs to be financed in Europe. It's not the same thing necessarily. That's why you have all these taxonomies popping, you know, everywhere, not just because there is not a global government leading to global taxonomy that would not probably not even be, you know, something we would like, but also because you have different mitigation and adaptation needs in terms of finance, but also needs in terms of access, depending on the region. And it's also, you know, it depends upon your positioning in the supply chain. You don't have the same technologies and you don't have the same kind of industry when you're in Malaysia than when you're in Europe or the US even. So that's why it's not all about price. And as an economist also myself, it's weird to say that, right? But because we've not been trained this way. But the more you work with climate, the more you know it's not all about price. So I would concur with your, let's say, diagnosis, Luca. I would just say that that's where that whole climate information architecture thing comes in. A last example, we have very limited data. We all know that. In Europe, people are complaining that work elsewhere, you'll see how little data we've got elsewhere. We did a study within the network for greening the financial system, the NGFS, that some of you might know. We did a study and a report that led to a report in a data directory. It's called Bridging Data Gaps. We saw, for instance, and that's based on empirical study we made, 50% of greenhouse gas data in the world is estimated or modeled. 50%. You might think it's much less, right? Especially when you're in the EU. I'm not even talking about physical risk data. For instance, in high mountain Asia, in some parts of Africa, you have no data at all. And so it's not just about price. It's also about the kind of data you have on the actual impacts of the transition, the actual impacts of biodiversity loss and climate change. And that's very much relevant to investors as well, to companies as well. So again, I'm just talking in a very global sense because we're touching upon, you know, issues that would deserve one day of discussion each, but hopefully I'm giving that picture around the role of price on one hand and the role, of carbon pricing, and on one hand and the role of taxonomies very briefly, but on the other.
Alessio, would you like to react on that, or otherwise I may have another question for you too.
Yes, maybe just one word, because it's a topic that is very close to my heart, which is how, is this going to be a growth opportunity, which is what you were asking. And to my mind, there is some discussion even among economists. So I'm glad that then maybe we can disagree with Charlotte or not, or at least I can flag, even if I end up agreeing with Charlotte, I can flag that there is disagreement among economists on whether, let's say, decarbonization can be a growth opportunity or not, or should be seen as an opportunity aside from the challenges that are rightly well known, that your video was mentioning, that Charlotte was to a certain extent hinting at in terms of prices, cost of living, and so on. And to my mind, again, I think it's useful to look at it through the lenses of something that resembles an industrial revolution. And if you were to do that, what this suggests is that yes, there is the high probability that there will be, let's say, winners and losers, and that for the winners, this will be a growth opportunity. And what this hints at is that in the moment in which you're reshaping your whole economy, you're reshaping production, consumption, and so on, this means recasting comparative advantages across countries, or for individual companies, it means reshuffling the winners and losers between between companies, technologies, and so on. And these things matter a great deal. And to my mind, if we agree that the only credible future, basically we have only two credible futures ahead of us. One is one that is of climate disaster, and another one is of a green future, let's say, where we manage to decarbonize. And so if we look at it that way, it makes sense to try and be at the forefront of this revolution, of this transition, both as a country and as a company. And the alternative is that you risk being stuck in technologies that are, or products that are considered very fast, very soon, as lower quality or perceived as older and lower quality. And to a certain extent, I would argue also more expensive, because generally the point gets made that, you know, right now the green option is the expensive option, whereas the fossil fuel based alternative is the cheap one. And there is nothing, you know, intrinsic in the technology that says this must be the case forever. This has been the case because we have invested for 150 years in improving the internal combustion engine option. And so now it is very, very cost effective. But there is nothing that says that after long or large investments in the electric vehicle option, that will not become cheaper. And actually, we're seeing these cost curves come down immensely and very fast. And we're seeing already some of these technologies, for example, for the production of electricity and the renewable energies being cheaper than the fossil fuel alternative already nowadays. And so this idea that, you know, it is a cost and we've got to do it because it's the right thing to do to decarbonize, but it is expensive, sort of misses the point that actually trying to be a leader in these technologies will come with huge benefits. And just to give you an example, and in closing, we've seen it in the past as well. And so if for those of you that drive cars, you might know what a Daimler is, what a Benz is, what a Maybach is. These are all names of engineers that at the turn of the last century were helping build the internal combustion engine car. And what this suggests is that having leadership, developing early leadership and becoming being at the forefront of the new technology entrenches some benefits that are long lasting. And so you want to try and make sure that you are the one driving this change early on, and you might become the leader of this new technology for decades to come.
So that's actually also a common point with the UN Global Compact regarding how moving forward as a first mover can be a real advantage. We say that those who do in sustainable development, they're gonna get the benefits of it. And of course, the members that joined the UN Global Compact 20 years ago, 15 years ago, today they're ready, or they're way more mature to act that transition. And that's very important, because in these transitions that use tools like we can call it tools, even if it's a regulation, EU taxonomy, which is a technical reporting methodology. The use of data, the creation of data that creates information, gives to these first movers, but also to the followers, information to lead strategic scenarios forward. And that is, I'm doing the link with what also Charlotte said in terms of a lot of people in Europe are complaining, but I'm sure that all around the world they will complain even more because they feel like obliged to follow this EU taxonomy. But so that's the advantage that that we see in developing in a sustainable way. And so this information is a key to take decisions, because we, and you may tell us if you agree, but we have been using reporting for years, but only to satisfy investor requests, but not as much to take the right decisions. And we see it with the climate issue. So recentering the information on taking decisions toward a just transition might be the right answer to those who complain about over-reporting, or what does reporting mean to the company. They only see as a number of full-time employees working on this reporting, but they don't see the outcome of that and how useful that can be in 10 or 15 years. Any reaction, quick reaction on that?
No, I mean, I would totally agree, of course. I mean, we're always saying, you know, that strengthening that so-called climate information architecture, it's not only to provide information to investors. I mean, of course, there are major informational challenges for financial market participants that are associated with climate change. There is a lack of useful information. You've got limitations, and I think everyone around the table knows that in terms of its quality, its comparability, its consistency. But the role of these taxonomies, for instance, as you were saying, is to provide the benchmark, let's say, for capital allocation. I think we have to say the words at some point, for transition planning within a company, within an industry, in view of, let's say, achieving climate-related objectives. Of course, it's got anti-greenwashing functions. Of course, it provides, hopefully, science-based, technology-based information, but it's also for these purposes. And you know, as you were pointing out to my comment on the lack of data outside EU borders, we've done and we've published a study recently. I transferred to you, Luca, recently on emerging markets, developing economies that are the core of our work at the IMF. I was amazed to see personally that no study had been done on the reason why, or at least part of the reasons why emerging markets, developing economies are substantially, let's say, further away from private capital. All the trillions we're talking about right now, it's only millions or billions, are mostly directed towards advanced economies. I mean, of course, we know the constraints from a fiscal debt capacity, institutional capacity also of emerging markets, developing economies. But we looked at the distribution of ESG scores of firms, and it's largely dominated by scores for firms that are listed in advanced economies. And we could not explain that by the size of firms, for instance, because you might say that the size of firms of companies in emerging markets, developing economies is usually lower, so that could be explained. And we also saw that allocations of ESG funds to these economies are way lower than those of other funds. So even so-called ESG funds are providing even less money to emerging markets and developing economies. And that's driven partly, to be fair, by the relatively small size of ESG funds that are dedicated to emerging markets and developing economies, but still. So the reason why I'm giving that example is that one of the reasons why you don't have that climate funding and you have a substantial, we're talking about trillion worth gap in terms of climate financing in those economies, is also due to the fact that you don't have data disclosures against by companies located, domiciled there, which is, when I'm talking about there, it's the majority of the world. You don't have the information whether or not they're aligning on the low carbon pathway. What are their risks? What are the opportunities there? So you need taxonomies for that. And that's why we've seen 35-ish taxonomies being developed, as I said at the very beginning, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in India, in China, in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I would totally concur with what you were, saying, based on that let's say, emerging, developing world approach as well.
Maybe just one word, but I'll be extremely brief on this point. I think that to a certain extent, if you are if you're a company, let's say, and you are a climate leader, or you think you are on top of a technology that is fundamental for decarbonization, you should be welcoming this type of reporting. And although it is true, it comes as a cost, you've got to hire some people and you've got to fill in these 60 odd pages of information. It is a chore, sure, but bear in mind that it implies that you will be receiving more funds from the capital allocation that Charlotte was talking about, means that you're going to receive more investment. And the alternative is the so-called greenwashing scenario, which normally is looked at from the consumer perspective and usually with a moral perspective in mind, like, oh, look, these are companies that are just slapping green on their label and they're not doing anything or whatnot, or they're cheating me. But even from a company perspective, and with even putting moral aside, if you had no type of disclosure conditions and reporting, you would receive less funds, and some of these funds would just trickle to companies that are not actually contributing to the decarbonization challenge at all. And so you should be welcoming that if you are, let's say, in good faith, trying to contribute to the green transition, because this will be helping you out over the medium and long term.
Good point on the on the good faith. So at the UN Global Compact, that's what we see. Also try to show company that how useful this kind of dynamic information, disclosing the right information, how that can be fruitful for the company in terms of more investments, more credibility, more transparency, and then renewed trust in the management. And that's when we talk about management, trust and reputation. That's what they teach us in the first course of university in management. Is the key to lead forward the company strategy. And here we come to the last question. Then we will have some time for questions, answers. I have seen a few questions coming in the chat, but also on the Q&A function. So we have seen that green transition is a need, is requested, is demanded, but especially is due to the next generations. And so there are institutions that are working on that. There is Charlotte at FME, for example, working on many taxonomies. You, Alessio, work on policy side, and you have seen the Green Deal. You have seen many policies at European level in order to make that true. But the risk is probably disorganized transition, because that may lead to inequalities, and that we come again to the just transition. So how do you see this issue in terms of there are companies today that will focus especially on transforming, but not anymore on developing new areas, for example, and that may actually lead to that inequality. If a company that have operations in France, let's assume, they will focus on transforming those operations in France, but what about those areas that may be needed of investments? That is also an issue that probably is not outlined, but how do we ensure that we are going to answer that 2030 agenda? Is the transition an answer to that, or do we need to do more? And do you have examples of probably programs that at the institutional level are oriented to that? Alessio or Charlotte, as you want.
let's scramble the order, given, and then I leave the last word to Charlotte. I think, I mean, in a way, building on what I was saying before, if you're trying to fast track innovation, as you're doing that, you're transforming economies, as we were saying, and some, you know, it is a fact that as you do that, some companies will emerge as winners, some will emerge as losers. Some type of skills will become obsolete. Some regions might be left behind, regions that were focusing on whatever it is, old technology of the past, the classic coal extraction region type thing. And to me, the challenge is that I sort of draw, again, I'm a bit obsessed with economic history, so I try to draw a lot from of my experience and understanding of what's going on from economic history. And there are people who have looked at these innovation pushes. For example, Kalestos Juma, who was a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he's looked really at you know, large innovations throughout history. You know, even, for example, the printing press, and why did it spread in Europe and it didn't spread in the Ottoman Empire, and things like this. What he says is, if there is a large group of people who either is left behind or perceives that it is being left behind by a new type of innovation, they will oppose it, full stop. And this type of phenomenon is what has determined that innovation spread in certain areas of the world and it didn't in others, in different points, different moments, different civilizations. I am using that type of understanding to say, if we don't go hand in hand, so if we don't match all our policies to accelerate innovation with policies to bring people on board, they will oppose it. And so it is sort of a social limit to the green transition, aside from the technological difficulties, let's say. So there is a technological component, engineers telling me how hard it is to roll out all the electricity and so on. There is that. But to me, to my mind, it is even harder or more important to make sure that the social component is also there. Or if you don't have the two, it's not going to happen. And crucially, this type of people, again, there's some work by Rodriguez Pose, Andres Rodriguez Pose, was an economic geographer at the London School of Economics. And what he says is, when there are regions, places that don't matter, he uses this provocative term, but effectively it means regions that are left behind and people that don't feel they're part of the economy. What these type of people want is not necessarily cash. So it is not that you're trying to buy out, you know, consensus, but they want to be part of the future economy. And so you have to reinvent these type of old skills or old sectors and so on, or so that regions can be part of the future economy. And to link and in closing, I think that this type of thinking is what is behind measures like the just transition mechanism at the European level, which is again part of the European Green Deal. But this idea that you look for regions that are at risk of losing out, part of the transition, and you help them reinvent their economic system structure so that they can be reintegrated into a green economy. This is done, you know, top down in the sense that there are funds coming, but it is done bottom up as well, because you don't want to impose a growth model on a certain region. But you try to bring the two together based on this type of thinking.
Very nice references and interesting that the EU Green Deal is also answering, I mean, is addressing that. Charlotte, at IMF level, are you addressing these, let's say, disharmonization areas that may not be focus of the green transition, or maybe be left behind? Any example or take on that would be appreciated.
No, thank you. Well, it's actually done in a variety of ways, and I won't go into the debate and the extremely important discussion on debt sustainability sovereign debt sustainability and the just transition. The economists are on the table. I see that Pierre is here, would probably like that, but we don't have time for that. But I would say that's one of the ways, of course, that the IMF has a huge role, obviously, when it assesses sovereign debt sustainability in these countries and provides lending. The just transition and the idea of a social contract. Yesterday at the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, there was a dedicated panel on that. Is becoming more and more a center of these extremely important tools that the IMF has and mobilizes, but it's only ongoing, if I may say it this way. I would totally agree, of course. I mean, accompanying, structural policies are needed to ensure that just transition. And so you need to repurpose human and physical capital while rebuilding the infrastructure to low carbon economy. There is engagement capacity development on my side, for instance, South Africa, huge coal producer, and exporter. And so the reason why we're looking at that, I'm going to give two examples. The first one is that there is the just transition from the perspective of emerging markets, these developing economies that have been relying on, I think Alessio was referring to, like old school technologies. And the thing is that when you have all of these advanced rich countries saying that we should decarbonize and that we are repurposing supply chains that have real impacts on people there, and usually, at least from a personal, point of view perspective, I would say that's not really discussed in Europe or in the US. We see the just transition at the level of your own country, but not necessarily abroad. When it's probably, and I'll say that between, in a personal capacity of you, of course, but a bit hypocrite, because we all rely at some point on these people to actually build stuff, and I say it in the broad meaning of it, that is essential to our own well-being. So that is why there are several tools that we can mobilize for that. The second example I'll give is the fact that investors can only do so much. And the reason why I'm saying that is that we often talk about the just transition in a very general manner on the role of capital allocation, for instance, by investment funds and the incorporation of social dimension, the shareholder engagement. That's really important. And obviously, as an investor, you can have an impact within a company through these means. But you also need, as a company, to incorporate the impacts of the transition on your wages, on your internal carbon pricing, for instance, also on the prices of your products and services, hence on the impact on jobs, on productivity, on labor within your company. And that is an essential part of a transition plan. I know we didn't have time to dig into that, but all the work we're doing internationally on global standard setting for climate-related disclosures, the IMF has very strong views on the content of transition plans, and that incorporates that. Actually, in a public reply we've made to a consultation last summer, we've really emphasized that. And then on taxonomies, and that's the reason why we are doing all of this technical assistance and more in the future in taxonomies. It's because you have all of these regional taxonomies, again, everywhere, as I was saying, and we need a common ground. It doesn't mean that you need a global taxonomy. For many reasons, that's not even desirable, but you need a common ground because you need investors to be able then to pick each one of these tools and be able to make, the sound decision, let's say, whether it is in South Africa or whether it is in South America, for instance. And the reason why it's important is because the just transition consequences are obviously different across countries. And depending, again, on their main sources of greenhouse gas emissions domestically, depending on the exported emissions, depending on the added value of some of their industries and their related carbon intensity and all that. And only within these countries you may know the actual social consequences of all that. So all the work we are doing on taxonomies is really important in that matter. And we're really hoping that, not just hoping, but working so that it provides one of the right tools to, for these countries, again, to attract private climate finance, but also to attract private climate finance with a real social dimension at the global level, multilateral, I would say, like between countries, but also domestically.
Thank you, Charlotte, on that for that, and thank you for mentioning the transition plan, which are one of those tools which are really useful. And what we see is really that, well, many institutions are working to make this transition happening. So the message is run, because it's going to happen, and if you arrive last, it's worse than arriving at least as a follower, but run fast. So before leaving you, I'd like to take a couple of questions. So if the people connected also like to ask questions, that's the time. So far, I've seen I had a question from Marcos One, which is a colleague from the Netherlands local network, saying, Alessio, do you see the balance between decarbonizing now versus betting on future innovation? So I think the meaning of that question is, do we have to decarbonize? What is the balance in between the decarbonization now and real betting on new innovation?
So I guess this links to this idea that, you know, part of the decarbonization pathway, let's say, is typically explained with technologies that perhaps are not yet there. Think of how to decarbonize steel, cement, aviation, not to mention carbon capture and storage, and so on. And so this feeling that we are betting the future of the planet on technologies that don't yet exist. And so that we should be taking more aggressive measures now because we are sort of banking on technology to save us, which is a very dangerous bet. And to my understanding, this type of reflection, which is, I understand where it comes from, but to me, it feels a bit as if technology were a very aleatory dynamic, and so we're just hoping for a technology god to show up and save the day. And to my mind, actually, technological innovation is a much more deterministic process, and it has been throughout human history to a certain extent. So it is not even a recent phenomenon that responds to needs. And so the whole effort, linking it back, you know, from the macro perspective to today's topic, what taxonomies are trying to do, what carbon pricing are trying to do, and so on, is to generate a need in the way of slapping extra costs on polluting activities / polluting firms in order to, let's say, create the need for innovation on that front. And we have seen throughout that when that is the case, you develop new ways of doing things. And so I'm not too concerned. I don't know, I mean, I'm not a futurist, I'm not Jeremy Rifkin, so I'm not going to tell you that, I don't know, hydrogen planes are going to save the day. I don't know. But what I know, being more of an innovation economy expert, is what the process looks like. And then what the specific technology that works is, I don't know. And to my mind, it's even beyond the point. Probably it's the stuff that we're not even thinking of right now.
Thank you, Alessio. We have 2 minutes before leaving you. I don't know if you, Charlotte, you want to take a question. There is one about data gaps. Bring the policy to land in a different way between prices and taxonomies. If that is true, if that is the case, the strategy, future scenarios can be different. Here, how, I mean, are those data gaps actually leading to different ways? That means that there may be regions, countries that may have different price levels. This is what I have understood from the question, but maybe, I don't know if you can read the question yourself.
No, I've read it, and I'm not
yeah.
sure to completely understand, but maybe, I mean, I can say two things. The first one is that notwithstanding those data gaps, the issue with correctly measuring from the financial sector perspective, right? The issue with correctly measuring climate-related financial risks also stems from the need to maybe or let's say amend scenarios, energy climate scenarios, the ones used in stress testing. The fact that a lot of the business as usual scenarios are not even reflective of the current reality that is bound to stay. So it's not just about an issue of data gaps, it's also about the frameworks in which you entail or you embed, I would say, your climate-related risk analysis. I'm saying in a super broad way, but hopefully that does answer part of the question. The second one, I think it's that, I mean, you also have data gaps because you have insufficient financing of so many technologies that do allow you to have better data. It's also because you have a lack in regulatory policies in many countries, not requiring such data from companies. And as Alessio touched upon, and you, Luca, as well earlier, companies in Europe see it as a burden. It's actually, it's maybe a burden, and I'm sure it isn't for so many companies. Also because maybe there is an over-reporting kind of machinery now going on that is not good, but still it's an opportunity because you can then measure your risks and also position yourself. So and this despite the initial lack of data, maybe in some respect. I don't know if that answers the question at all, but in a 30-second time I had, that's all what I could come up with. So hopefully that partly answers it.
It's thank you for answering. I mean, I've been tried. We do have other questions, but I'm afraid we are running out of time. So
just to say, Luca, if I may interrupt you, the questions on taxonomies and all that, you can maybe provide our emails to the participants.
Exactly.
I think Pierre has mine, but I can put it in the chat as well on the projects we do on this topic, for instance, but I'm sure there are others for Alessio as well. Don't hesitate.
Yeah, I will follow up after this webinar, reaching the people that I've connected to us today, and providing answers to those questions and your contact details. So if Alessio and Charlotte, you will be, please, you will be there to answer those questions. I really want to warmly thank you both for the collaboration, for having given us such a wide view on the issue, which is very, I mean, complex. Well, it's actually not an issue in negative terms, but it's really bringing new perspectives, new opportunities. And thank you again. So I hope to see you soon in another occasion, and we will follow up by email. So you will be, you will get all the answers, all the questions answered.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you, Alessio. Thank you, Luca.
Goodbye.
And Niels. Thanks,
Goodbye.
everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.